Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet the old fat pig we have to put up with. The words hit me like ice water. Standing there in my custom charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, I watched Bradley's new bride, Sophia, gesture toward me with a champagne flute while her wealthy family erupted in laughter. Then her father's face went white as fresh snow. "Wait, aren't you Mr. Harrison, my new boss at Harrison Industries? Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button." Let me tell you how I ended up being called a pig at my own son's wedding, the wedding I'd paid for entirely, down to the last rose petal. 2 hours earlier, I'd been adjusting Bradley's bow tie in the church vest, proud as any father could be. "Thanks for everything, Dad," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know the wedding cost a fortune, $300,000 to be exact. Not that I was counting." I watched him fiddle with his cufflinks, the same ones my own father wore 50 years ago before I lost him when I was just a young man. "Your grandfather would have been so proud to see you today," I whispered while straightening his jacket. But as I stood in that reception hall listening to my son's new in-laws mock me to my face, I realized that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. The Harrison family held the keys to half the commercial real estate in Chicago, and James Harrison, Sophia's father, sat atop a business empire worth billions of dollars. What he hadn't realized yet was that his own company's board of directors had voted me in as the new CEO exactly 1 week ago. My first official day on the job was scheduled for Monday morning, and the irony of the situation was starting to sink in. "Mr. Harrison," James stammered, his hand shaking so much that his champagne glass began to rattle. He looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole as he muttered about having no idea who I was or that Sophia hadn't mentioned our connection. "Mentioned what, Daddy?" Sophia asked, her voice turning sharp and laced with confusion. She looked back and forth between us, her perfect pageant smile finally starting to crack as her father struggled to explain that Bradley's father was actually Arthur Harrison. A heavy, suffocating silence spread through the room like red wine soaking into a white linen tablecloth. Sophia's mother, Patricia, tried to intervene by stepping forward with the kind of polished, fake smile that wealthy women spend a lifetime perfecting. She laughed it off as a delightful coincidence, suggesting we simply shared the same last name as her husband's firm. "It isn't a coincidence at all," I replied calmly, watching James's face turn several different shades of pale. I explained that Harrison Industries was my family's legacy and that I had taken full control of the estate and its assets years ago. The math was pretty straightforward, even for a crowd of people who were a few drinks deep into a wedding reception. I held the controlling interest and the voting power, which meant I had the authority to hire or fire anyone I pleased, including the man standing right in front of me. Sophia's laughter died out instantly as the color drained from her face. "Wait, are you actually saying you own my father's company?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Not own, dear, control," I replied, wearing the same cold smile I'd used to close 100 different board meetings over the years. I made sure she understood there was a massive difference between the two. Bradley appeared at my side just then, finally picking up on the thick tension in the air. "Dad, is everything okay?" he asked, looking concerned. I looked at my son, the man I had raised all by myself after losing his mother so young. I was the one who worked 2 jobs to get him through business school and sacrificed every comfort to give him a shot at a real life, yet I noticed he was standing just a little bit closer to his new wife than to me. "Everything is just fine, son," I said, patting his arm reassuringly. I told him I was simply getting to know his new family a little better. James cleared his throat loudly, his survival instincts as a businessman finally starting to override his embarrassment. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps we could get together next week to talk things over," he suggested, trying to regain some footing. "Monday morning," I interrupted before he could finish. 9 o'clock sharp, and my assistant will send over the office address. I turned back to Sophia and gave her my warmest, most professional smile. I congratulated her on the wedding and told her I was sure we'd be seeing a lot of each other from now on. As I walked away, I caught the sound of Sophia hissing at her mother, demanding to know why no one told her I was someone important. "We had no idea," Patricia whispered back in a panic. She told her daughter that James had described Bradley's father as just some middle-class widower. The phrase, "just some middle-class widower," echoed in my head as I walked toward the restroom to find a moment of peace. I locked the door and stared at my reflection in the mirror, taking in the man looking back at me. My suit was sharp, my watch was understated but worth a fortune, and my expression remained composed despite the emotional earthquake I had just endured. In that mirror, I saw a man who had spent 30 years building a business empire in his late wife's memory. I saw a man who had raised a son alone and paid for every single thing he owned, from his education to this very wedding. I had been called a pig by people who didn't realize I could dismantle their entire world with one phone call. More importantly, I saw a man who was finally beginning to understand the true extent of his own power. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from my assistant. The board meeting was moved to Tuesday because an emergency HR situation needed my direct attention on Monday morning. I checked my tie in the mirror and allowed myself a grim smile. Monday was definitely going to be a day to remember. The road to that humiliating moment at the reception really started about 18 months ago, back when I made the mistake of being a little too generous with my son's happiness. Bradley had called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could tell right away by the tone of his voice that he was about to ask for something expensive. "Dad, I've got some incredible news." "Sophia said yes," he blurted out, sounding breathless. I had been in the middle of reviewing some quarterly reports in my home office, but I pushed the paperwork aside immediately because my son was engaged. Despite all the business stress, the father in me was genuinely thrilled for him, and I told him how wonderful it was before asking when he'd popped the question. He told me he'd done it the night before at Aurelio's, that fancy downtown spot where I'd taken him for his graduation dinner. I remembered that meal well, specifically because the bill had been $400 for just the two of us, but seeing how proud he was of his MBA that night made every cent worth it. I settled back in my chair and told him to give me all the details, listening for an hour as he gushed about the proposal and the ring, which apparently cost more than most people's cars. He didn't mention how they planned to pay for a wedding that night, but that conversation finally came around a month later. "The thing is, Dad," Bradley started, his fingers drumming nervously against my kitchen table while he struggled to find the words. "Sophia's family has certain expectations." I poured him another cup of coffee and watched him carefully, noting how he was going out of his way to avoid eye contact. Having raised him as a single father, I knew all his tells, so I asked him exactly what kind of expectations he was talking about. He started listing off high-end venues, mentioning that her sister's wedding was a massive affair at the Four Seasons with 300 guests. He followed that up by telling me her cousin got married at the Drake Hotel and that Sophia had been dreaming of something just as grand since she was a little girl. I stayed quiet, knowing that in business, silence is often the most powerful tool you have in a negotiation. He eventually cracked and told me the venues she was looking at were around $200,000 just for the basics, which didn't even cover the music, the flowers, or the photography. I repeated the number back to him calmly, and he scrambled to justify it, telling me she was the one, and that he wanted to give her everything she deserved. I sat there thinking about what I deserved after sacrificing so much for his future, but looking at his hopeful young face, I felt that familiar tug of fatherly love override my common sense. I asked him if he'd even tried talking to Sophia about a smaller ceremony, but he insisted I didn't understand because her family was really wealthy. He told me her father owned Harrison Industries, and the irony of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. My son had no clue that I'd been quietly buying up shares in James Harrison's company for years, building toward the controlling interest my late wife and I had always dreamed of securing. When I asked if he felt pressured to match their lifestyle, he simply said he wanted to be worthy of her, and those few words absolutely broke my heart. I'd raised that boy to believe he was worthy of anyone, and I felt like a failure wondering how he'd come to believe that love required such a massive price tag. He begged me for help, promising to pay me back once his career took off, but I knew his mid-level consulting job wasn't going to fund this lifestyle anytime soon. When he finally threw out the number, $300,000, it sat between us like an unwelcome guest at the table. He pointed out that I could afford it and even mentioned his mother's life insurance, which made me feel sick to my stomach hearing him calculate her life so casually. I told him I needed to think about it, and that night, I sat in my study looking at a photograph of his mother. We had started our own firm together with one tiny office, and I asked her picture what she would do, though I already knew she was always too soft on Bradley. The next morning, I called him and said yes, but standing in that bathroom mirror at the wedding, I realized that one word had transformed me from a doting father into something much more dangerous. By Monday morning, I was going to be their new boss, and they were about to find out that my generosity had very strict limits. Monday arrived with that sharp Chicago autumn chill, and I dressed the part in a power suit with minimal accessories and a look that had been intimidating boardrooms for 2 decades. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the Harrison Industries boardroom to find James Harrison fidgeting with his phone like a nervous kid. He stood up quickly to thank me for meeting so early, but I took my seat at the head of the table and told him we needed to clear some things up before we started. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the stock certificates and legal filings that proved I now owned 51% of the company. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that as of last Monday, this was my boardroom and he was officially working for me. James looked like he was about to have a panic attack, stuttering about how the company had been in his family for 3 generations. I corrected him immediately, explaining that his grandfather was actually the junior partner to my wife's family back in 1952 and that the contracts were crystal clear. I slid a manila envelope across the polished wood table and waited for him to see the reality of his new situation. Inside that folder were photocopies of the original partnership agreements, documents I'd spent years tracking down through legal archives and private collections. I explained to him that while his family had managed the business well enough as minority owners, everything changed when my wife passed away and her shares came to me. I had spent the last 15 years quietly snatching up every bit of additional stock that hit the market. "This is impossible," James whispered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the stack of paperwork. I allowed a small smile to surface and told him the only impossible part was that he hadn't noticed it happening right under his nose. His own board had already approved my appointments to key positions, his CFO was now reporting directly to me, and his legal team was already answering my calls. James looked up at me with a look of pure horror and asked what I wanted from him. "First, I want a sincere apology for how your daughter acted at the wedding reception," I stated firmly. He tried to defend her, calling her spirited, and claiming she didn't mean anything by her remarks. I cut him off immediately, reminding him that she called me a pig in front of 200 guests, including my own son. When he tried to excuse it by saying she was young, I reminded him that at 28 and married, she was plenty old enough to understand that actions have consequences. I leaned forward and told him exactly how it was going to go. Sophia would call me that day to apologize, not because he told her to, but because she finally understood that respect is mandatory in this family. James nodded frantically, promising to speak with her right away, but I wasn't finished yet. I told him our second order of business was to completely restructure the company's employee benefits program, which I found embarrassingly inadequate for a firm of this size. Harrison Industries employed over 300 people, yet their health insurance was mediocre and their retirement options were practically non-existent. I informed him that the improvements would cost about $2 million a year and that he should consider it my personal contribution to social responsibility. James's voice cracked at the mention of the $2 million, but I told him I'd seen the profit margins and knew he could easily afford it. I pulled out another folder filled with a detailed financial analysis I'd commissioned months ago, covering every expense and hidden asset the company owned. Third, I informed him that his son-in-law Bradley would be receiving a promotion to senior associate with a significant salary bump, noting that he's actually quite bright when he applies himself. James looked baffled and admitted he didn't even know Bradley worked there, to which I replied with genuine warmth that his first day would be Wednesday. He stared at me like I'd just declared myself the king of Illinois and started stammering about needing to talk to his attorneys first. I told him his attorneys had already reviewed and cleared everything the week before, then I snapped my briefcase shut with a decisive click. I laid out the timeline, the benefits announcement on Thursday, Sophia's apology today, and Bradley's promotion effective immediately. As I walked toward the door, I paused to remind him that the next time his family discussed the middle-class widower his daughter married into, he should mention that the widower now controls their entire source of income. James just sat there, gasping like a fish out of water, while I cheerfully wished him a lovely day and walked out into my new empire. By noon, my assistant had already handled half a dozen calls from various members of the Harrison family and a very panicked voicemail from Sophia herself. She left a message claiming there was a misunderstanding about the company and hoped we could talk things over like family. I listened to it twice, noting how she carefully avoided mentioning her insults or offering an actual apology. She called again at 2 o'clock, her voice noticeably shakier, claiming she was just nervous meeting my side of the family and said things without thinking. She was still trying to play the victim, so I deleted those messages without a word. Tuesday morning, James appeared at my office door at 8 sharp, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. He begged me to work things out, saying Sophia was beside herself with worry, but I just gestured for him to sit down. I explained that when someone pays for a daughter's entire wedding, the venue, the food, the flowers, every single penny totaling over $300,000, reasonable behavior usually involves basic courtesy. I pulled out the receipts I'd gathered from Bradley the night before and spread them across the desk for him to see. James stared at the invoices, his face turning paler with every line item as he realized his daughter had no idea who was actually footing the bill. I walked to the window and told him that Sophia only felt comfortable mocking me because she thought her family's money made her untouchable, but that was about to change. By Thursday afternoon, the news of the new benefits package had sent shockwaves through the entire Chicago business community. People were starting to realize that Arthur Harrison wasn't just a new face. He was the new sheriff in town, and things were changing fast. The first real sign that my message was hitting home came Wednesday evening when Bradley called me, his voice tight with a mix of confusion and genuine fear. "Dad," he stammered, "Sophia's father just offered me a massive job today, and I don't know what's going on." "It's a senior associate position, Dad. Starting salary is $90,000 plus full benefits," Bradley explained, his voice crackling with a mix of excitement and doubt. He told me it seemed like a dream opportunity, but it felt a little too much like charity, especially since Sophia had been acting so strange since the wedding. Apparently, she was refusing to tell him what was bothering her and kept grilling him with invasive questions about our family's bank accounts. I just smiled into the phone and asked if he'd actually taken the job. "Well, yeah, it's double what I was making at the consulting firm," he admitted. "But did you have something to do with this, Dad?" I told him that he was a sharp man with a solid MBA and that maybe James Harrison had simply recognized his talent, but he clearly wasn't buying it. He asked me point-blank if there was something I wasn't telling him about the Harrisons, so I suggested he ask his wife, since she seemed to have plenty of new insights. The second sign that the tides were turning came Thursday morning when my assistant mentioned that Patricia Harrison, Sophia's mother, wanted to meet for lunch. This was the same woman who had stood there like a statue while her daughter insulted me, and now she suddenly wanted to grab salads and chat. I told my assistant to set it up for Friday at noon in the private dining room of the Chicago Club. Friday arrived with a gloomy, drizzly sky that matched my cynical mood as I waited in that elegant room for Patricia to make her entrance. She showed up right on time, wearing that classic understated wealth that looks expensive without needing to shout about it. "Arthur," she said warmly, acting as if we were old pals, "thank you for meeting me. I've been dying to get to know you better." I gestured for her to sit, watching as she settled in with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life at these kinds of social lunches. She spent the first few minutes rambling about the weather and the restaurant's reputation before finally getting to the point. She claimed she wanted to address the incident at the reception, calling Sophia impulsive, and suggesting she was just overwhelmed by the big day. I repeated the word impulsive back to her, making it clear I wasn't accepting that excuse for being called a pig in front of 200 people. Patricia insisted that her daughter was mortified and had wanted to call me personally but was too worried about making things worse. I took a slow sip of water and pointed out that while she was worried, she had managed to call my office 3 times without ever actually uttering an apology. Patricia's smile faltered, and she tried a different tactic, suggesting that Sophia was simply intimidated by my success and the business empire I had built. I reminded her that my late wife and I built that empire from the ground up and that I was simply carrying our vision forward. She quickly pivoted to praising the new employee benefits I'd implemented, calling them generous, but I knew exactly where she was going with it. She admitted that James was a bit concerned about the financial hit the company would take from such massive changes happening so quickly. I looked her in the eye and asked if she was actually questioning my business judgment. She tried to backpedal, saying James was just a conservative manager who got nervous about big spending, but I leaned back and asked her what she really knew about my son. The question caught her completely off guard, and she stammered that Bradley seemed like a lovely young man who was devoted to her daughter. I told her he was perhaps a little too devoted, considering he spent every dime he had on an engagement ring and even borrowed money for his suit just to meet her family's standards. I let the number hang in the air, $300,000. I told her that was the cost of her daughter's perfect wedding, and it didn't come from the Harrisons or from Bradley, it came from me. The color drained from her face as she realized they had completely misjudged my bank account. I pulled out a slim folder and explained that while her husband's company looked great on paper, their actual margins were paper-thin and their lifestyle was built on a house of cards made of credit lines and leverage. I looked at her trembling hands and made the reality of the situation very clear. I could fire her husband tomorrow, sell off their untouchable assets, and replace him with a more competent leader in a heartbeat. Their wealth was theoretical and highly vulnerable, and I held the shears ready to cut the strings. I told her that Sophia could call me that night with a real apology, not because she was scared, but because she realized that being cruel is unacceptable regardless of social status. I stood up and laid my napkin on the table, telling her that if she apologized, we were family, and I always take care of my own. I picked up the check and told her lunch was on me, then walked out while she was already frantically dialing her daughter's number. By the time I hit the street, I had a text about an emergency board meeting for Monday, but I just smiled at the drizzle. Sophia finally called at 9:47 p.m. that Friday, just as I was settling into my leather armchair with a glass of scotch and a good book. Her voice sounded completely different this time, much smaller and stripped of that entitled confidence that had carried her through our previous encounters. "Mr. Harrison, this is Sophia," she began, her tone hushed as if she were afraid of being overheard. "I know it's late, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow to say this." I greeted her calmly, and she immediately dove into a real apology, one that didn't feel like the half-hearted attempts she had been making all week. She took a shaky breath and admitted that what she said at the reception was cruel and inexcusable, acknowledging that calling me a hog was wrong regardless of what she had been feeling. She finally voiced the reality that I had paid for their entire wedding, and she had repaid that generosity with public insults and humiliation. I said nothing for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air to see if she would dig deeper. "I've been thinking about why I did it," she continued, her voice trembling. "And I think I was just scared because Bradley talks about you constantly. How strong you are, how successful you've been, and how you raised him alone after your wife died." She confessed that she felt like she could never measure up to the father Bradley described, which was a far more honest admission than I had ever expected from her. She explained that when she saw me at the reception, looking poised and elegant, she felt inadequate and small. Instead of dealing with those feelings like an adult, she lashed out to make herself feel bigger by trying to diminish me. I asked her quietly how that worked out for her, and she whispered that it hadn't worked at all. It backfired spectacularly, and she had ended up hurting the person she should have been thanking. She asked for my forgiveness, claiming she wanted to be the kind of wife Bradley deserved and the kind of daughter-in-law I deserved. I took a slow sip of my scotch, weighing her words and sensing a flicker of genuine remorse, even if it was partially fueled by the fear of losing her family's lifestyle. I thanked her for her honesty and her willingness to be vulnerable about her motivations. When she asked if we could start over, I told her we could try, but I made it clear that trust is rebuilt through consistent actions rather than just emotional words. She agreed instantly, promising to do whatever was necessary to make things right. Before hanging up, I asked her one final question about why she felt so comfortable insulting me in front of her family, suggesting it was a planned humiliation rather than a spontaneous mistake. After a long silence, she admitted that she had told her family beforehand that Bradley's father was difficult and always trying to interfere in their lives. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest when she revealed she was simply repeating what Bradley had told her. My own son had been painting me as some kind of overbearing, meddling parent just to justify taking my money while keeping me at arm's length. She told me Bradley complained that I didn't know how to let go, that I treated him like a child, and that I used my wealth to maintain control over him. I closed my eyes, feeling something fundamental break inside of me as I realized the son I had sacrificed everything for was systematically undermining my character to his new family. I thanked Sophia for her courage in telling me the truth and watched as she tried to defend him, saying he was just confused about how to be grateful without feeling guilty. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my study, surrounded by my late wife's things, trying to reconcile the son I thought I knew with the man who saw me as a burden to be managed. My phone buzzed with a text from Bradley, who mentioned he heard I talked to Sophia and hoped we could all have dinner soon to work things out. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying that we definitely needed to talk soon. Saturday morning brought another surprise when James Harrison showed up at my front door at 8 sharp, looking like he had aged 5 years in a single week. I invited him in, noting how he carefully scanned the room, taking in the original artwork and the photographs that spoke of a life built on substance rather than just show. He admitted he wanted to speak privately before Monday's board meeting because he needed to understand my true intentions for Harrison Industries. I told him my intentions were simple: to run an ethical, profitable business that actually took care of its people. He complained that the benefits and facility improvements I authorized weren't sustainable given their current margins. I poured him a cup of coffee and asked him what he actually knew about the company's real financial position. When he claimed they were profitable but conservative, I corrected him immediately, stating that they were actually stagnant and heading for a cliff. Your company owns 37 commercial properties in prime Chicago locations, yet the rental income you're bringing in should be at least 50% higher than what's currently on the books, I said, handing him a cup of coffee before sitting down with my own. I told him straight out that his problem wasn't a lack of profit, but a complete failure of management. He was trying to run a massive 21st-century real estate empire using business practices that were outdated back in the 80s. James tried to act stiff, claiming he'd been in the game for 30 years, but I reminded him that while he'd done adequately, that just wasn't going to cut it anymore. I gave him a smile that had absolutely no warmth behind it and mentioned that this brought us right to the matter of Monday's board meeting. James shifted uncomfortably, mentioning that the board had some concerns about how fast things were changing under my new leadership. I laid out the math for him very clearly. The board has 7 members, and between the 3 I appointed myself and the 2 who respect my wife's legacy, that left only him and his cousin Edward. I watched his face turn as the reality of corporate democracy finally sank in and he realized he was outnumbered. He set his cup down with shaking hands and asked what I actually wanted from his family. I want what I've always wanted, respect, I told him firmly. I explained that I wasn't looking for respect for my money or my title, but for basic human decency, which his daughter clearly lacked when she insulted me at the wedding I paid for. I walked over to the mantel and looked at the photos of Bradley, from the day he was born to his college graduation, and told James that Sophia's casual cruelty revealed a real ugliness in her character. When he tried to use her youth as an excuse again, I shut it down, saying she was old enough to be a wife and understand the weight of her actions. I turned back to him and admitted that Sophia wasn't my real problem. My son was. Bradley was the one who had been bad-mouthing me to his wife, painting me as a controlling manipulator while simultaneously pocketing $300,000 of my money for his wedding. James tried to say family is complicated, but I told him that come Monday morning, I planned on simplifying things considerably. Monday morning's board meeting started at 9 sharp, and James Harrison looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. The other board members filed and looking confused, having no idea they were about to witness a total corporate revolution. I took my place at the head of the table and introduced myself properly, handing out folders that detailed my MBA from Northwestern and my 20-year track record of managing 8-figure portfolios. I made it clear that I wasn't some grieving widower playing at being a businessman. I was a professional who had been strategically buying up their stock for 15 years. Edward, the treasurer, tried to argue that the company had been successful under Harrison family management for 60 years, but I wasn't having it. I pulled out a comprehensive analysis showing that their revenue growth had been flat for 7 years and their profit margins had been tanking since 2018. I pointed out that they were sitting on gold mine real estate but charging below market rents just to preserve relationships with tenants who were clearly taking advantage of them. I informed the room that, effective immediately, every single rental agreement would be adjusted to fair market value, and anyone who didn't like it could pack their bags. Edward stammered that this wasn't how they did business, but I looked him in the eye and told him that since I controlled the company, it was exactly how we were doing business from now on. When James tried to claim they couldn't afford the $2 million benefit increase for the employees, I dropped the hammer on him. I pointed out that the family had taken nearly $2 million in executive salaries the previous year while contributing almost nothing to the actual business operations. I called out his son for spending his marketing hours on the golf course and his nephew for collecting a 6-figure salary while delegating every single task to contractors. I announced that executive pay would now be tied to performance and that family members would be fired if they couldn't justify their jobs with actual results. James desperately called for a vote, but I turned at the door and told him I didn't need his approval for business decisions. I only needed his compliance. As I walked out, I heard Edward whisper, "How did we let this happen?" But the answer was much simpler than they realized. They had been so preoccupied with maintaining their comfortable lifestyle that they never noticed someone else was quietly building the power to dismantle it. As I returned to my office, my phone buzzed with a text from Bradley. "Dad, can we have dinner tonight? Sophia is really upset about everything that's happening with her family." I stared at the message, feeling that familiar tug between paternal love and a growing sense of resentment. My son wanted to discuss his wife's feelings while remaining completely oblivious to mine. 7 o'clock at my house, I texted back. It was finally time for Bradley and me to have the conversation we should have had years ago. The afternoon brought a parade of panicked phone calls from various members of the Harrison family, all trying to understand what was happening to their protected world. I ignored most of them, but I picked up when Patricia Harrison called at 3 p.m. "Arthur, please. We need to talk. The family is in crisis," she pleaded. I told her the family was simply experiencing accountability for the first time in decades and that I'd hardly call that a crisis. She mentioned that James had come home looking like someone had died and had locked himself in his study. I suggested he was likely reflecting on 30 years of mediocre business practices. When she accused me of taking personal revenge for the wedding, I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the skyline. I told her that if I wanted revenge, her family would already be homeless, but since they only understood power, I was simply speaking their language. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day reviewing personnel files, but my mind kept drifting to the evening's dinner and the revelation of how my son really saw me. At 6:30, I set the dining room table for 3, using my finest china and silver. If this was going to be a confrontation, it would at least be a civilized one. Bradley and Sophia arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, both looking like they were attending a funeral rather than a family meal. Sophia's eyes were red from crying, and Bradley wore the same expression he'd had as a child when he knew he was in trouble but couldn't figure out how to fix it. "Dad," he said, kissing my cheek awkwardly, "thanks for seeing us." I told him he was always welcome, and we sat down to a meal filled with uncomfortable small talk. I finally set down my fork and looked directly at my son, telling him we needed to discuss something that had been troubling me. His face went pale as I mentioned that Sophia had told me about the conversations they had regarding my character. Specifically, his concerns about me being controlling and manipulative. The color drained completely from his face as he realized his wife had shared their private discussions. He stammered that he was just trying to prepare her, but he couldn't explain for what. He looked helplessly at Sophia, who was studying her plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. He tried to claim he didn't want her to feel obligated to accept help if it came with strings, but he couldn't give me a single example of when I'd actually tried to control his life. I reminded him that I supported his decision to major in literature even when I suggested business, and that the only girlfriend I ever disliked was the one who literally stole from him. Bradley squirmed in his chair, realizing his examples were thin and nonsensical. I pointed out that despite his discomfort, they both accepted $300,000 of my help for the wedding. He tried to claim they were grateful, but I stood up, my voice remaining calm despite the rage building inside me. I told him he was actually resentful, that he wanted my bank account but not my presence. He wanted me to be a vault, not a father. When he tried to deny it, I asked him to explain why his wife felt comfortable calling me a hog in public and why she thought her family would find it funny. Sophia finally looked up through her tears and admitted she did it because Bradley told her I used money to stay involved in his life when he wanted independence. The words hung in the air like poison gas. I walked to the window and realized that my financial support for his entire life was being framed as manipulation rather than love. I turned back to them and told them they were right. I had been using money to maintain our relationship, but starting tomorrow, that was over. Bradley's voice cracked as he asked what I meant by "it ends," and I recognized the tone of a child realizing his actions had consequences. I told him I was done being his personal ATM and that there would be no more checks, gifts, or emergency loans. I smiled without any warmth and told them they were now officially financially independent, just as they wanted. Sophia looked panic-stricken, claiming there was a misunderstanding and that they never said they didn't want my support. I told her the problem was solved since she believed that support was just a tool for control. Bradley jumped up from his chair, shouting that this was crazy, but I remained unmoved. "One stupid comment at a wedding and you're cutting us off completely?" Bradley shouted, his disbelief finally boiling over. My voice remained dangerously calm as I looked him in the eye. I reminded him that his wife didn't just make a comment. She called me a hog at his wedding while surrounded by her family, who only laughed because he had spent months painting me as some kind of interfering burden they had to tolerate. He tried to claim he never used that word, but I counted off his betrayals on my fingers. He told her I couldn't let go, that I treated him like a child, and that I used my wealth to maintain control. I asked him point-blank what he would call that characterization if not a burden. Bradley sat back down heavily, the sheer magnitude of his mistakes finally starting to sink in. He tried to argue that he was just trying to manage expectations, because Sophia's family had money and he didn't want them to think I was a charity case. I told him that instead of protecting my dignity, He made me sound like a manipulative old man who couldn't accept that his son had grown up. I walked to the sideboard and poured myself another glass of scotch with perfectly steady hands. I asked him when exactly I became such a weight around his neck, and when helping him through college and paying for his wedding shifted from love into manipulation and controlling behavior. The silence stretched thin until Sophia finally spoke up, her voice small and trembling. She admitted that Bradley was just desperate to fit in with her family and wanted to appear independent and successful, which he felt he couldn't do if people knew his father was supporting him. She explained that her family can be incredibly judgmental about anyone who needs help, and I took a slow sip of my drink as the real dynamic finally became clear. They were both embarrassed by my generosity because it made them look weak to people whose opinions they valued more than mine. I told my son that he was happy to take my money but ashamed to admit it came from me, wanting all the benefits of my success without any of the social complications. When he begged me to just move past it, I told him we were definitely moving past it, just not in the direction he was hoping for. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found my attorney, Richard Patterson. Bradley asked nervously what I was doing, and I told him I was calling the man who handles my estate planning. I hit the speakerphone button so they could hear every word as Richard answered and asked how the wedding went. I told him it was educational, and that I needed to make some immediate changes to my will. The silence in the dining room was deafening as I instructed Richard to remove my son as the primary beneficiary and establish a charitable foundation instead. Bradley shot to his feet so fast his chair clattered to the floor, yelling that I couldn't be serious. I ignored him and asked Richard if he was getting all this, noting that my son seemed surprised that his actions actually had consequences. Richard tried to suggest we wait for a less emotional moment, but I told him this wasn't emotional. It was logical. I asked why on earth I would leave my life's work to someone who views my support as a form of manipulation. Sophia started sobbing harder, and Bradley looked like he was physically ill. I told Richard I'd call tomorrow to finalize the appointment and hung up. I looked at my son's stricken face and felt a small pang of regret, but it wasn't enough to change my mind. He called my decision extreme, but I reminded him that he had spent years accepting my financial support while privately resenting me for it. He'd encouraged his wife to see me as an obstacle and sat in silence while her family mocked me to my face. He promised he could fix it by talking to the Harrisons, but I told him they weren't the ones who were wrong about me, they were just wrong about how much disrespect I was willing to tolerate. I began clearing the dinner plates, telling him that while his wife's apology was sincere, it revealed that every cruel thing she believed about me had started with him. Bradley slumped back into his chair and whispered that he never meant for it to go this far. I told him he just wanted to have his cake and eat it too, taking my money while distancing himself from any obligation to show me respect. He asked what he could possibly do now, and I told him he could start by being honest about why he really resented me. I explained that my help wounded his pride because it reminded him he wasn't as self-sufficient as he wanted to believe. Instead of working harder to be independent, he chose to accept the cash while vilifying the source. I told him I would always love him, but I was done enabling a one-way relationship. As I walked toward the kitchen, he asked what happens next, and I told him he was finally going to learn what genuine independence feels like. And maybe if you're very lucky, you'll discover that earning someone's respect is more satisfying than taking their support for granted, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. I left them both sitting at the dining table in stunned silence and went to my study to call Richard Patterson back. It was time to finalize the changes to my estate planning and get that charitable foundation off the ground. Tuesday morning brought the expected fallout from Monday's confrontation, but the first call didn't come from Bradley or Sophia. Instead, James Harrison's name popped up on my caller ID at 7 o'clock sharp. He sounded frantic as he told me we had a massive problem, but I just took a slow sip of my coffee and asked what was troubling him. He explained that 3 of our largest tenants had received lease renewal notices demanding rent increases of 40%, and they were all threatening to move out. I smiled and told him that was unfortunate, but I was confident we could find new tenants who actually understood fair market value. James started listing off the companies, panicking because one firm alone represented 12% of our income. I reminded him that those firms had been enjoying 1980s-era subsidized rent for 2 decades while their own profits skyrocketed. If they wanted to leave, I told him, I already had preliminary talks with 3 other firms ready to pay what the space was actually worth. James tried to argue that I couldn't make these calls without consulting the board, but I reminded him that having a controlling interest means I can make any decision I want. I told him he could come to the office at 9 if he wanted to talk more, but I made it clear that while his family built relationships, they were really just exploiting them. After I hung up, I spent my morning reviewing the massive restructuring plan I'd developed over the weekend. Rent increases were just the tip of the iceberg. I was ready to eliminate redundant positions and implement performance standards that would shock everyone into either being productive or resigning. My second call came from Patricia at 8:30, and she was sounding close to a total breakdown. She accused me of trying to destroy the company out of spite, but I corrected her, stating that I was simply optimizing performance. I told her that if her family's comfortable incompetence was threatened, that wasn't my concern. When she claimed I was punishing everyone for the wedding, I explained the difference between punishment and consequences. Punishment is about hurting someone for the past, but consequences are the natural result of poor choices, like treating a family business like a private piggy bank for decades. I pulled into the office garage and told her that under my management, Harrison Industries would finally reach its full potential, regardless of whether her son or nephew could survive outside the family safety net. I gathered my things and headed inside, where the tension in the building was so thick you could practically feel it radiating off the floors. My assistant told me James had been there since 7:30 and had called an emergency meeting with senior staff for 10 o'clock. I told her to cancel it cheerfully, noting that I'd be handling all communications with the staff myself. At 9 o'clock, James knocked on my door looking like he hadn't slept in a week. He asked if my endgame was to force his family out of the company entirely. I told him I was running a business, and if his family could adapt to professional standards, they were welcome to stay. If not, that was their choice. I pulled out the new organizational chart I'd drawn up and watched as James stared at it with growing horror. His son's marketing job was gone, his nephew's role had been merged under an outside contractor, and even his own title had been demoted to general manager. He accused me of gutting the operation, but I told him I was streamlining it so that fewer people would actually be doing real work instead of just pretending to. He brought up his 60-year family legacy again, but I reminded him that they had been underperforming that entire time. James slumped into his chair, finally realizing his world was disappearing, and asked what it would take for me to sell the company back to them. I finally just smiled at him and asked why on earth I would sell a profitable business to people who have already proven they can't manage it effectively. James tried to argue that it was his family's legacy, but I reminded him that it was actually my wife's legacy and his family just happened to be the ones running it into the ground. Right then, my phone buzzed with a text from Bradley asking to talk and promising he wanted to make things right. I showed the screen to James and told him that his family wasn't the only one learning about the weight of consequences today. I explained that my son was about to find out what life looks like when you can no longer take someone's support for granted, including the fact that I was actively changing my estate planning to reflect his behavior. James looked stunned and told me I was being incredibly harsh, but I reminded him of the hog comment and the way his family laughed along with it while my son sat by in silence. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the Chicago streets, and told him that I'm 60 years old and have spent half my life building businesses and making everyone else's life easier. I told him I was done being taken for granted by people who benefit from my hard work while privately resenting my very existence. I turned back with a smile that made him visibly uncomfortable and told him that the best part of being in control is deciding who actually deserves my time and resources. I made it clear that from now on, everyone, including my own son, was going to have to earn them. My assistant knocked and told me Bradley was in the lobby, desperate to see me. I looked at James and noted that today seemed to be full of people wanting to negotiate with reality before sending him on his way. I told James our meeting was over and that he had a lot of work to do if he wanted to keep his title. Then I braced myself for the next round of truth. Bradley walked in looking humble and genuinely contrite, a far cry from the entitled man he had been just a few days ago. He sat in the chair James had just vacated and admitted he'd been up all night thinking about how his resentment of my help was really just wounded pride. He set a manila envelope on my desk and told me I was right about everything. I stayed silent, letting him lead the way, and he pushed the envelope toward me, saying he found something while going through old papers to figure out where we went wrong. Inside were bank statements and loan documents that left me completely confused until he dropped the bombshell. He wasn't just ungrateful, he was a fraud. My blood went cold as he confessed he had been fired from his consulting job 6 months ago for falsifying expenses. He admitted he had stopped paying for his BMW months ago and that the car was about to be repossessed before he landed the job with the Harrisons. I stared at the papers, trying to process the fact that my own son was a stranger to me. Then he confessed the worst part: the apartment rent, the credit cards, and even the engagement ring were all funded by loans he took out by forging my signature as a co-signer. He used my credit rating and my reputation to steal over $100,000 while I was none the wiser. I stood by the window, trying to breathe, as I realized that when he told Sophia I was the manipulative one, he was actually describing his own reflection. He admitted he was projecting his crimes onto me because he couldn't face what he had become. I looked at him and saw a man who had been lying and stealing his way through life while blaming me for his struggles, and I realized he had put my entire legal standing at risk. "They're current as long as I keep making the minimum payments for my new salary," Bradley stammered, his eyes darting toward the floor. I looked at him and reminded him that if he missed even one payment, I'd be the one held liable for the full amount, plus all the interest and penalties he'd racked up. I sat back down, my mind racing through the legal mess he'd created. Identity theft, fraud, and forgery. These weren't just family squabbles anymore. They were federal crimes that could land him in prison. I asked him why on earth he would risk everything for a lifestyle he clearly couldn't afford, and he finally broke down, tears streaming as he admitted he was simply ashamed. He told me Sophia's family had so much money that he felt he had to lie about being successful and independent just to be worthy of her. I pointed out the obvious. He wasn't independent at all. He was drowning in debt while pretending to be a high flyer. He confessed that when I offered to pay for the wedding, he saw it as his only salvation, hoping he could just buy enough time to get promoted or find a better job before the lies caught up with him. He thought he could buy his way into a reality that didn't exist, and I realized he'd been treating my reputation like his personal safety net. I pulled out my phone to call Richard Patterson again, and Bradley panicked, begging me not to make it public because it would destroy his marriage and his career. I told him flatly that his life was already destroyed. The only thing left to do was figure out how much of the wreckage we could actually contain. When Richard answered, I told him I needed to see him immediately because my son had just confessed to committing identity theft using my name. The silence on the other end lasted for several seconds before Richard asked how much money we were talking about. I told him it was roughly $120,000 in fraudulent loans and credit agreements. Richard told me to be at his office in an hour, and I hung up to face the stranger sitting across from me who happened to be my son. I told Bradley he was going to see my attorney, cooperate fully with whatever was recommended, and finally learn what accountability actually looks like. He asked if I was going to have him arrested, and I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, but the days of me protecting him from his own choices were over for good. I put the documents back in the envelope and asked him if Sophia knew any of this, and his no told me everything I needed to know. She had married him under completely false pretenses, thinking she was building a life with a successful man instead of a criminal. 3 hours later, we were in Richard's office watching him review the evidence with the grim look of a man who'd seen 1,000 family disasters. The good news, Richard said, was that we could resolve this without criminal charges if we moved fast and stayed quiet. Bradley sagged with relief, but I remained tense, asking what the catch was. Richard explained that I would have to assume responsibility for all the debts to protect my own credit rating, as the banks would pursue criminal remedies the moment they discovered the forgeries. The total cost to clear his name was going to be $137,000 once the penalties were factored in. Richard suggested we characterize the payments as family assistance, rather than fraud remediation to keep the authorities away. He informed Bradley that he'd have to sign a full confession, agree to strict repayment terms, and submit to financial monitoring and counseling for the next 5 years. Bradley tried to argue that he didn't have a problem, but Richard snapped back that forging his father's signature to fund a fake life was the definition of addictive behavior. I stood by the window and told Richard to prepare the papers. I would cover the debt because, unlike my son, I take responsibility for cleaning up messes instead of making them. Bradley would keep his job at Harrison Industries, but every cent of his salary beyond his basic survival would go straight to me for the next 8 years. As we walked out of the office, he finally asked the question that had been eating at him, whether I was going to tell Sophia the truth about the loans and the lies. I looked at him with a cold, clear focus and told him that I was absolutely going to tell her the truth. I made it clear that if our family was going to fall apart, it was going to happen on a foundation of honesty rather than a pile of secrets. "She'll leave me," Bradley choked out, the fear finally overriding his shame. I told him plainly that she might, but she deserved to make that choice based on the reality of who he was rather than the fantasy he'd sold her. We drove back to Harrison Industries in a heavy, suffocating silence, both of us lost in the wreckage of the truth we'd uncovered. When we walked through the doors, My assistant handed me an urgent message stating that Sophia had called 3 times in a state of total distress. She'd mentioned something about finding financial documents in Bradley's home office, and I watched my son go pale as he realized he hadn't hidden the loan papers well enough. An hour later, Sophia was in my office crying hysterically while Bradley sat beside her, finally dropping the facade because he had nowhere left to hide. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and explained that she'd found loan applications with my forged signature, noticing that the handwriting didn't match the checks I'd written for the wedding. I confirmed her suspicions with a simple yes, and when she asked how much money was involved, I told her it was more than she wanted to know. She turned to her husband with a look of utter bewilderment, telling him he wasn't the man she married because the person she said "I do" to had a career and stability, not a mountain of criminal debt. She began pacing my office like a trapped animal, realizing her father had only hired Bradley because she'd begged him to help her husband's career move forward. She screamed at him, asking how long he'd been lying, and the answer was always. Since they met, since they got engaged, and every second since they took their vows. Finally, Sophia turned to me and admitted she owed me more than just an apology for the hog comment. She owed me one for dragging me into their mess. She realized I'd been the one paying for everything and cleaning up Bradley's crimes while she had spent her time resenting me for being too involved in his life. She sat back down, her composure completely shattered, and admitted that I actually hadn't been involved enough, that if I'd known the truth, maybe I could have stopped him before everything collapsed. I looked at this young woman who had insulted me just 6 days ago and saw someone facing the total destruction of her life. She asked what she should do, and I gave her the best advice I could after 30 years of making hard choices. I told her not to make marriage decisions based on business complications or other people's convenience, and warned her that she couldn't love someone into becoming the person she thought they were. Sophia looked at Bradley, who was staring out the window as if he could disappear through the glass, and told us she needed time to think because it was all too much to process. After they left, I sat alone and realized how much I'd changed in less than a week. The old Arthur would have quietly covered the debt and continued enabling the dysfunction just to keep the peace. But the man I had become had different priorities, and when Patricia called me a few minutes later, I was ready for her. She tried to claim I was destroying her family, but I told her they were doing that to themselves and that I was simply refusing to help them along anymore. Patricia kept begging for us to resolve things as reasonable people, but I just laughed because she still thought the problem was my anger rather than her family's behavior. I explained that my anger was just a signal that they had crossed boundaries I should have set years ago. I told her that now, everyone was going to have to learn to earn their place. Her daughter would learn about honesty, her husband about competence, and her son-in-law about the weight of his crimes. When she shrieked that I was destroying everything they had built, I corrected her one last time. I told her that I wasn't destroying their legacy. I was simply exposing the rot that had been there all along. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.